The old man lived alone by the bend in the river, a place no one came to anymore. Each evening he cooked 2 bowls of soup, but only ate one, until that rainy night in September, when a naked woman, lashed and bruised, hid in his horse shed. She didn't beg, she didn't cry, and he, for the first time in 12 years, ate both bowls. Out on the barren rock plateau where the San Miguel River turned, Silas Whitaker's wooden shack stood solitary, like an old hat someone forgot. There was no fence, no mailbox, no proper road leading in. To reach it, you had to wade through waist-high weeds, following wheel ruts faded like memories from the decades past. Silas had lived there for 17 years, but after the winter his wife died. Only half of him went on living. The other half he'd buried with her plain coffin beneath the pines behind the house, the same trees he passed each morning but never once stopped at for long. Dawn in that region didn't begin with light. It began with the sound of metal, rusty nails in the wooden roof expanding from the cold dew, popping softly like old bones settling. Silas woke without a clock. He listened to those sounds like a voice he knew well, calling him to rise and do what he still did. Go on living, even if for nothing. Beneath the porch, a rocking chair, missing one armrest, leaned askew. The day his wife died, someone had dragged it to the middle of the porch to wait for news. Silas never moved it back. Perhaps he feared his hand might stir awake something that had long gone quiet. The little kitchen hadn't seen anything new since 1874. Fires were still kindled with old paper scraps. The blackened aluminum pot was the same one she used for soup. Each night he still made 2 portions, not out of habit, not because he imagined she was still there, but because he never knew what to do with the other half. And that empty chair, he still pulled it out before sitting down, a small act, but his hand did it gently, as though he feared disturbing time itself. On windless nights, the little house spoke only in the groans of its wooden bones, and in those moments he wouldn't sleep, he'd listen. Not out of fear, but because some part of him still hoped, as thin as smoke, that someone, anyone, might knock, not to ask for help, not to save him, just to sit down. One day, while chopping firewood behind the old chicken coop, Silas froze mid-swing. In the split log, a crack shaped like a teardrop appeared. He let go of the axe, touched the mark lightly, then smiled. No one saw it. But for the first time in years, his face held more than just tension from the sun. That evening, he set the table as always. 2 bowls of soup, 2 silver spoons, one polished bright, one worn and nicked. He sat down, fingers gently curled around the spoon, and looked at the untouched bowl. Wind swept across the porch, fluttering a page in the old notebook on the table, where his wife once jotted down recipes for winter soups. The paper stilled on the line that read, "Add a touch of thyme at the end, if the cold is harsher than usual." Silas didn't read it aloud. He just tilted his head, then walked into the kitchen, and for the first time in years he sprinkled a pinch of thyme into the untouched soup. Outside, the sky turned slowly to violet. The San Miguel River still flowed, still curved, still said nothing, and the chair across from him, tonight, was still empty, but the bowl before it was still warm. There are bends in rivers that don't show up on maps, not because someone forgot to draw them, but because they never wanted a name. The San Miguel curved like a scar, its waters swirling quiet, unnamed. Silas called it the Mute Bend, the place where he once stood, gun cocked, but turned back because hunger gnawed louder than death. Silas didn't fear that place, but he never approached it at night. He called it the Mute Bend. No one heard, no one repeated it, but the name lived inside him like the only thing left beyond soup and ashes. From the porch, if you sat at just the right angle, You could see the sun strike the water at that curve each morning, a shard of light, sharp and cold, like a knife honed too long. Silas often sat staring at it, not to remember, but to know he could still feel cold. It was at that bend, in the first year after she died, that he brought out the gun, sat there till near dawn, never pulled the trigger, not out of regret, but because he was hungry. After that, he never picked up that gun again. There was a jagged white limestone rock near the water's edge, shaped like a wolf's tooth. The old-timers used to call it the Silver Fang. Children once threw stones there, competing to see whose splash flew highest. But now, no one played that game. No one left time behind. No one left footprints. Silas still saw the old tracks when it rained, round depressions in the soft soil, faint, blurred, but not quite gone. He didn't know whose they were. Maybe his sons. Maybe some man who came by before she died. But one thing was certain. They never turned back. The reeds by the riverbank were once where his wife gathered herbs. When she was alive, he followed her every evening, basket in hand, listening to her name each plant, wild daisy, foxglove, thyme. Now the reeds grew wild, waist-high. No one picked, no one explained. Silas had tried clearing some once, but the next morning the wind carried seeds from the opposite bank and drove them into the wet soil. They sprouted again, faster, thicker, as if fighting to reclaim something lost. He didn't cut them anymore. On certain afternoons, he'd walk to the water's edge to wash his hands. The water was so cold it felt like it cracked the skin open. He would crouch, touch the surface, and wait. Not for anything in particular, just wait for a fish to leap or a wind to shift, or nothing at all. That silence, it made him feel real, not false, not in need of explanation. They say the Western land is mute, but Silas didn't believe that. He thought the land is only silent when it's listening, and this river bend, it had listened so much that it no longer had words to give back. And in a strange, paradoxical way, this very place, the one with no name, no voice, would one day become where the footsteps that would awaken his life again would be heard. But Silas didn't know that, not yet, not just yet. That September night began like any other. Wind brushed past the porch, jostling the loose tin sheet overhead, tapping out a familiar rhythm like a clock ticking. Silas sat at the wooden table, 2 steaming bowls of soup before him, one for him, one for the empty chair. Outside, the moon hadn't risen, but the clouds had gathered. There was no thunder, no warning, just a kind of thick silence, as if the air itself were holding its breath. He sipped slowly. Wind slid through the cracks in the window, flickering the oil lamp's flame. Silas raised a hand to shield the light, then resumed eating, same as every night, until he heard wood creak, not loud, not clear, but wrong. The horse shed, 10 paces from the house, had long been abandoned. Its door hung crooked on rusted hinges. No one had set foot there in years. He hadn't kept horses since the year she died, but that sound, like someone brushing against a beam by accident, made Silas freeze mid-spoon. He didn't take a gun, didn't bring a lamp, just rose, pulled on his wool coat, and stepped outside. The air wasn't cold, but the wind felt like it came from somewhere else. Not the usual dry western breeze, but something damp, heavy, carrying the scent of water and the feeling that something was about to happen. Silas walked slowly, eyes adjusted to the dark. Wet grass stroked his pant legs. He didn't rush. There was only one thing within him, a vague, certain sense that after tonight, that house of his would no longer be the same. The horse shed door was slightly ajar, unlocked, no sound, but the smell was different. Old sweat, fresh mud clinging to wet fabric, dried blood. Silas stood at the threshold, didn't step in right away. He listened, as if by standing long enough, whatever was inside might confess its presence. A breath, quick, light, but real. He stepped forward. In the hay and dry grass piled in the shed's corner, There was a woman, curled up, bare, trembling. Her hair hung in tangled clumps, matted with sweat and dirt. Her shoulders hunched, her back arched like a small animal trying to vanish into itself. By her leg, a blotch of blood, not flowing anymore, but still fresh. She didn't raise her head, didn't ask for help, just hugged her knees, buried her face, and stayed still, as though her very existence was some kind of mistake. Silas said nothing, just stood there, eyes on Delia curled in the straw. Wind pushed through the slats in the shed roof, scattering old leaves like brittle memories. He remembered the night his wife died, and May, the one he couldn't hold on to. This time he didn't want to just watch. He took off his wool coat, laid it gently on her shoulders, then turned and walked back to set another place at the table. The woman lifted her head. Her eyes met his. Gray-blue, wide, full of fear and abandonment. No words passed between them, but Silas saw something he hadn't seen in over 10 years, a look begging to survive, not for pity, not from weakness, just simply, I can't run anymore. Silas removed his coat, stepped forward. She didn't flinch, didn't recoil, didn't raise her hands. He didn't wrap her like a father, didn't kneel like a savior. He only laid the coat on her shoulders and turned his back to leave. No promises, no plan, just this. That night he set an extra place at the table. She didn't come in right away. Silas returned to the wooden cabin, fed the fire more wood, and ladled a fresh bowl of hot soup. His hands carried the smell of smoke, his shirt still damp with night dew. He set the bowl on the table. Across from him the familiar chair. The empty chair was pulled out as always, but this time he quietly turned it to the side. The door remained open. The wind tilted the oil lamp's flame, stretching his shadow long across the wall. A lone figure. Now just slightly askew, she stepped in as if the room might collapse should her foot land in the wrong spot. The wool coat hung past her knees but couldn't hide the scraped legs beneath, dark skin blotched with dried blood. She lingered near the door, eyes locked on him, as though gauging how fast she could run if needed. Silas didn't look back. He simply nudged the second bowl closer to the edge of the table, then sat down. In front of him lay a silver spoon. Beside it, another, older, slightly bent, its handle worn smooth from use. He took the old one, not out of deference, but because that's what he did every night, for the one who was gone. Delia sat slowly, eyes fixed on the space between the two steaming bowls. Her hands clenched tight in her lap, as though any word might shatter the room. Suddenly, a gunshot echoed faint from the riverbank. Silas froze, fingers brushing the rifle hook on the wall. But he didn't reach for it. Delia leaned forward, placed her calloused hand on the table. "Delia," she whispered, as if that name were the last thing she still owned. Silas didn't ask a thing. He nodded, just once, and gently, then scooped up a spoonful of soup, blew softly and sipped. The scent of thyme drifted faintly from the other bowl, the one he had seasoned the night before for the first time in 10 years. Delia sat unmoving a moment longer, then reached for her spoon. Didn't speak, didn't look at him. Just touched the bowl like someone brushing against something they couldn't believe was real. The first spoonful, she didn't bring it to her lips, just pressed it softly against her mouth, then set it down. They ate in silence, not out of shame, not out of fear, but because that night no words were needed. On the table, steam from the soup drifted gently into the air. On the floor, their shadows stretched, almost touching, and outside, the wind had shifted, blowing now from the bend in the river toward the house. The next morning, there was no sun. Only a thin silver light spread across the roof like an old cotton sheet, the kind of light that made everything look like it had belonged to someone else first. Silas rose early, not because of the guest, He always rose like that, like a wind-up clock with its spring worn thin, but not yet willing to stop. He didn't go into the back room, just stoked the fire, boiled some water, and sat on the porch, hands around a hot cup of coffee, eyes drifting out toward the river. Delia hadn't come out. The door remained slightly ajar. He heard floorboards creak, the sound of bare feet on dry wood. Then silence. She hadn't left, hadn't stepped forward either, as if she were testing whether she was allowed to stay. By noon, she stepped outside. The coat he'd given her the night before was dry, and the hem of her dress had been replaced by a strip of cloth wrapped loosely. She held her arms to her body, not from cold, but as if holding herself together. Her face was pale, but the wild panic in her eyes had faded. Only weariness remained. Silas didn't ask if she'd slept well, didn't say, "Are you feeling better?" He simply nodded, like to an old acquaintance who'd just returned. She looked at him, longer than needed, then nodded back. That afternoon, he went behind the house to stack wood. She dug up a few small potatoes that had surfaced in the dry garden bed. Neither of them spoke. Only the distant call of a quail echoed from beyond the river, like someone playing a crooked flute on the far bank. As the sun began to retreat from the porch, she approached where he was tending the stove. Her eyes stayed low, arms full of kindling, chin dipped. And then, as though each word scraped her throat raw, she said, "Larkin." Just one word, but enough to make Silas stop moving. She sat down on the wooden stool beside the fire, eyes locked on the glowing embers, unblinking. Delia bowed her head, hands clenched tight as if still gripping the bottle she had smashed over Larkin's head. "He called it a cattle ranch," she whispered, "but there were only debts and chains." The fire popped. Smoke blew back against the wind, stinging the eyes. Larkin had papers, debt contracts, detainment rights. Said I signed them when I took the job. Said it was the law. Silas didn't answer. He knew the type. The West had never lacked men who wrote their laws in smudged ink and real blood. He gave me a room, clothes, food. Then one night, her voice caught. She wiped her forehead. No sweat, just a reflex, like brushing the past off her skin. He said I belonged to the ranch, that I had to earn my keep, started making me serve drinks, host guests, keep the place looking good. Silas looked at her hands, shaking but clenched tight. I stayed quiet for months, didn't cry, didn't beg. Then the night he gifted me to two men from Kansas, I took a whiskey bottle and cracked his head. Didn't kill him, but there was a lot of blood. She gave a sharp, broken laugh, not a sound that belonged to a person. I ran, barefoot, still soaked in whiskey. Don't remember the road, just knew I had to get far, far from there. Silas lowered his head. Didn't look at her, but his hand, the one gripping the axe handle for warmth, relaxed. He understood. No more words needed. After a long pause, he stood up and tossed more wood into the stove. "I'm not asking you to believe me," she said, voice rough. "Just, I wanted you to know." Silas turned, looked straight at her, without pity, without curiosity, just a nod, the kind one gives after hearing a long, solemn testimony. No jury, no sentence. "I know," he said, then added softly but clearly, "Paper's easy to write. Surviving it, that's the hard part." That evening, Delia gathered every last potato Silas had planted the year before. Small, thin, crooked, she washed each one, set them in a woven basket, and carried them into the kitchen. For the first time, they cooked a meal together. No one smiled, but the kitchen, which for years had only known the sound of Silas's cutting board and breath, now held the tap-tap of a knife on the rim of a pot. That night, the wind came down from the mountains, colder than river water, drier than the winter sky. Delia had fallen asleep. Silas sat alone on the porch steps, a wool blanket draped over his shoulders, hands wrapped around a cup of cold coffee. The fire in the stove had long since gone out, but in his mind another fire had just sparked. So old he'd thought it dead for good. 19 years ago, on a night just like this one, Silas had opened the door to this same cabin and saw a woman trembling in the wind, empty-handed, eyes red from sand and tears. Her name was May. Black hair, high cheekbones, and a voice that shook every time she said the words, "my ex-husband." May hadn't told her story all at once, but as she stayed, Silas understood. An abusive man, a child taken from her, a scar behind her left shoulder, small but deep. He didn't ask who gave it to her, she didn't say, but it was clear. She needed a roof over her head, even if only for a few nights. Silas had never thought of himself as the kind of man who could care for someone. He could do plenty, hunt, farm, fix a tractor, but to care for a person, especially a wounded one, was something else entirely. But with May, he tried. He didn't ask where she was headed, didn't try to make her stay. He simply gave her an old pair of leather boots, his wife's wool scarf, and a silver spoon, and said, "In case you want to make soup." May had smiled, her first smile, and in that moment Silas had thought, maybe, just maybe, he could live again. The next morning he went out to cut grass in the field. When he returned, she was gone. No note. The door left slightly ajar, the scarf folded neatly at the foot of the bed, the silver spoon gone. It wasn't until dusk that he noticed a scrap of paper tucked beneath the salt jar. "Thank you, I owe you one peaceful night." 3 weeks later, a sheriff from Planada came knocking with a warrant. May had been caught for misplacing church funds and carrying a pistol. The ex-husband had filed charges. No one asked why she had a gun or why she ran. They only asked Silas, "Did you knowingly harbor a fugitive?" He shook his head, and from that day forward, he never spoke May's name again. Now Delia lay sleeping in the back room, arms wrapped around a pillow like she was holding herself together. Silas watched the flickering oil lamp, its faint light dancing along the wooden wall, and in that fragile glow he saw May. Not her face, but her shoulders curled tight, the heavy breath, the eyes always darting to the door like someone expecting it to burst open. Delia and May weren't the same, but their pain sang in the same key. Silas stood slowly, walked to the old storage room. There, he pulled down a small wooden chest, so weathered its paint had flaked away. Inside, his wife's knitted scarf and an old pair of leather boots, small-footed, once belonging to May, but never taken with her. Silas set them on the table, wiped them clean with a dry cloth, and left them there. Said nothing, expected nothing, just an old man, offering the last life-preserver he had to someone who might be drowning. Out by the river the water had risen, catching broken reflections of the moon like shards of shattered glass. The wind didn't howl, just threaded through the roof slats, bringing back a voice once heard, a smile long lost. Silas no longer spoke May's name, but in his heart, the night Delia knocked on his door was the night memory came back, and asked him gently, "Will you be able to keep someone this time?" It was cold. Dew clung to the porch steps. Delia woke with red eyes, her clothes still carrying the scent of hay and wood smoke. Silas was brewing coffee. He didn't look up when she stepped out, just quietly placed another cup beside his. No one spoke. There was no need. Delia sat by the wood stove. She didn't touch the coffee, just watched the steam rise. And then her gaze landed on the old wooden table where two simple items lay, a silver-gray wool scarf and a pair of leather boots, worn but carefully cleaned. She looked at them as if unsure whether they were truly meant for her. Then she turned to Silas. He still didn't speak, just took a sip of coffee, eyes fixed on the mist-lit shimmer where the river curved in the distance, as if the items had simply been set there by chance. No meaning, no expectation. Delia stood, step by step, slowly, like someone stepping into forbidden ground. She touched the scarf. Her fingers brushed the coarse wool, rough but warm. Then she lifted it, draped it gently around her neck. It smelled old, smelled like this house. Smoke, dry wood, and something else. Something like peace. Next, she bent down and tried on the boots. They were a bit loose, but hugged her heels just right. The leather had softened with years. The toes were scuffed, but solid. They weren't a gift. They were a preparation, as if someone had held on to something, just in case one day someone with nothing left might need it. Delia began to cry, not loud, not in sobs, just a trembling in her shoulders and one tear that rolled from her cheek to her chin. She turned away, not wanting Silas to see, but he had already seen. He just said nothing. He took a spoonful of coffee grounds, dropped it into her cup, poured hot water, then stepped back, sat in his chair, and looked toward the river. Delia returned to her seat across the table. This time she picked up the cup. A while later she asked, "This scarf, was it hers?" Silas didn't answer right away. He stirred his coffee with the silver spoon, eyes still on the water. "Yes," he said softly, "but now it doesn't belong to anyone." Delia said nothing more. She just nodded, and for the first time, in her eyes, there was something that wasn't fear, wasn't defense. It was gratitude. It was trust. It was the faintest note of music in the middle of the silence. The house hadn't changed. Still the same old wood, peeling paint, crooked roof. But from that moment on, it held something else. A new breath. Not quite hope. Not quite peace. Just a first step. Outside, the wind whispered through the dry grass, and in that paper-thin chill, a woman sat drinking coffee in a wool scarf, and a pair of boots not made for her, but now worn on her feet. Horse hooves didn't echo that morning. The ground was soft from the damp night. Even the sunlight wasn't harsh, just lay gently across the wild grass, like an old sheet dyed pale yellow. Silas was chopping wood. His axe fell in steady rhythm, each log splitting like layers of time, revealing dark, aged hearts to the sun. Delia was fastening the latch on the horse shed, the wool scarf wrapped around her neck, her boots still marked with dew. She moved slowly, as if afraid to disturb the fragile quiet that had only just taken hold the day before. Then came the faint crack of a riding crop, and the shifting creak of saddle leather, carried in from the eastern slope. A man on horseback appeared, slow but sure. A gray felt hat pulled low, a badge barely visible beneath a waxed riding cloak. His gaze didn't roam. It moved like a checklist, reviewing things already known. Silas looked up. His face didn't change. "Deputy Hunt," he said hoarsely. "Whitaker," the man replied, bringing the horse to a stop at the foot of the steps. "Remember me?" Silas didn't answer. He set down the axe, wiped his hands on his trousers. From his coat, Hunt pulled a folded piece of paper, creased 4 ways, the red seal smudged by water. "Warrant," he said, as casually as speaking of the weather. "Theft, assault, fugitive violation." His voice was level, not loud, not soft, but the way he hit each word felt intentional, like striking a bruise to see who flinched. Delia was no longer in sight. She'd moved behind the wall of the horse shed, hand clutched tight on the doorframe. Silas didn't look at the paper. He glanced at Hunt's eyes, then down at the man's boots, newly polished but dusted at the heels with red clay from the San Miguel riverbank, not found on the main road. He'd been here before, maybe even last night. "There's no name on the warrant," Silas said quietly. "No date either." Hunt shrugged. "Blank warrant. Folks like her, hard to keep track." Then he tilted his head slightly as if to look around. He didn't say it, but his eyes did. "I know she's here." He dismounted, stepped onto the porch, not rushed, but each step sunk like a stake into the earth. "Want to sit down for something to eat?" Silas asked, voice still and low like river water at dawn. Hunt hesitated. He hadn't expected that, but he nodded. "If it's hot." Delia watched through a crack in the wall. She saw Silas walk into the house, lift the lid on the soup pot. At the table there were 3 bowls, 3 spoons, and 1 empty chair, placed near the window. Hunt sat down, set his hat aside. His eyes continued to scan, slow and measured. The house looked the same, but the air inside had shifted, quiet, like a still surface waiting for someone to throw the first stone. Silas ladled the soup, his hands steady, set the bowls on the table. 1 for Hunt, 1 for himself, and 1 left untouched. No one picked up a spoon. Wind stirred, slipping through the cracks in the walls. Somewhere near the woodshed, the stray cat gave a soft cry, then went silent. Delia gripped the axe in her hand. Her palms were slick with sweat, but her eyes didn't blink. She didn't know what would happen next. She only knew one thing. This time, she wasn't going to run alone. 3 bowls sat on the table like 3 shadows. Steam rose from the soup, curling together like smoke from a negotiation that had no words. The wood in the stove popped and crackled, but even that sound wasn't enough to break the thick silence pressing down on the room. Silas sat at the head of the table, his back slightly hunched, hands resting on his thighs. His eyes were on the soup, but his mind, somewhere far off, maybe in 1874, or maybe in the eyes of a woman who once cried on this very doorstep. Deputy Hunt sat across from him. He tapped his spoon against the bowl. The clang of metal on ceramic rang out, dry, sharp, not to eat, but to threaten. "Smells decent," he said, like he was probing for something beneath the surface. "Still using silver spoons, huh, Whitaker? Maybe you're not as poor as they say." Silas didn't respond. He took a cloth, folded it in half, and began wiping his hands, like a blacksmith at day's end, careful, even unhurried. Out in the woodshed, Delia held her breath. The axe was tight against her chest, its handle ice cold. Through the gap between 2 planks, she saw the faint outline of Hunt's back. He was smiling, a smile that never touched his eyes. None of the 3 had touched their bowls. There was only a steady ticking, the pendulum from the wall clock. With each swing, time seemed to thicken, pull tighter, hover closer. Everything in the house held its breath. Hunt lifted his head, placed his hand on the table. "Whitaker," he said, "if she's here, I'll keep it easy. But if you're hiding her—" He let the sentence dangle, leaning forward. "Then I'll come back with others." Silas looked up. His gaze didn't waver, but in it there was something else. Like a desert wind brushing through scorched canyon, a bell tolling by an empty road, or the soft sigh of an old man in half-sleep. "Not everything that's lost," he said, "deserves to be dragged back." Hunt curled his lip. "That's for a judge to decide." "Judges don't live at this bend in the river." Delia bit her lip until it bled. Her grip tightened around the axe, not from hatred but from the fear of running one more time. Every flight before had torn a piece of her soul. She wanted to stay, even if only for a single night. Even if it cost her. The room fell quiet again, the kind of silence left behind when someone stops a song halfway through. Then suddenly, a rumble of thunder far off to the west. The wind shifted. The horse in the shed gave a soft, uneasy whinny. Deputy Hunt moved his hand to his belt, right where the gun sat. Silas didn't reach for his. still hanging by the door. He only poured water into Hunt's ceramic cup. The sound of pouring, a small, delicate trickle, rang out like a needle sliding through cloth in the choking quiet. No one had eaten, but every person, every breath, every glance, knew there would never be another sit-down like this one again. The wind picked up. The wooden door creaked, tapping lightly against the wall like someone outside had reached for the handle, then changed their mind. Silas rose from the table slowly, as if only to add more wood to the stove. Deputy Hunt stood too, his back straighter, right fingers resting gently on the gun latch at his side. The night had grown thick and dark. Only the oil lamp lit part of the room, just enough to make every shadow stretch long and twisted, layered like the shapes of unfinished ghosts. In the woodshed, Delia didn't move. The wind slipped through the cracks, brushing against her cheek, cold like a warning. If you don't run, you fight. She gripped the axe. No more tears. Only one thought. If I'm caught this time, I'll no longer have a name. From the yard, a horse shrieked, sharp and angry. Hunt stepped onto the porch, pretending to check the saddle, but his hand was already on the grip of his gun. Silas followed, holding the oil lamp. They stood in the yard, in a patch of bare red earth, surrounded only by wind and shadows crawling along the broken fence line. Rain began to fall, not heavy, but enough to change the scent of the land, the smell of lightning, burnt straw, and old blood. And then it all broke loose. In a single blistering moment, a gunshot cracked. No one knew who fired first. Delia burst from the woodshed, axe swinging toward Hunt. He turned, striking her shoulder with the butt of his gun. But not fast enough. The blade tore through his coat sleeve. Blood splattered across his rain-slicked jacket. Silas fired a second shot and missed. His hand didn't tremble. He simply didn't want to kill. No one should die on a rainy night over a cheap piece of paper. Hunt turned his gun toward Delia, but Silas didn't stay still this time. He lunged, unarmed, placing himself between her and the barrel. The third shot tore through the dark like a scream. Silas fell, blood splashing across the wet wood. Delia screamed, not from pain, but because no one had ever stood between her and a bullet before. Not once. The rain came down in torrents, as if some leash had snapped. Deputy Hunt staggered back, slipping in the mud. Delia raised the axe, but drove it into the dirt right beside his face. She didn't kill him, even though she could have. She just stood there, breathing, like she'd swum against 1,000 rivers to get to this one place. Survival was no longer instinct. It was a choice. Silas was still breathing. Blood soaked the earth beneath him, but his eyes were open. Delia knelt beside him. No tears, just one trembling hand gripping his, tight. "No more running," she whispered. Not aloud, but he heard it. Silas gave a slight nod. His lips moved, but the wind took the words away. Maybe it was all right. Maybe it was his wife's name. Only his gaze remained clear, and it held no regret. Deputy Hunt didn't die. He crawled away, clutching his wound. His horse had fled with the first shot. The rain washed blood from his face, but not the shame from his heart. Delia didn't chase him. She pulled Silas under the porch roof, covered him with a blanket, lit the fire, and waited for morning. The wind softened after midnight. The rain still fell, but it was a gentler kind now, no longer the fury that had cracked the sky with gunfire. Even so, that quiet rain had brought down the porch roof. A board had split in half, snapped across the doorstep. Blankets soaked through. A pillow had floated all the way into the yard. The house, where Silas had lived for 16 years, now looked like an abandoned outpost after a flood. Delia made a temporary shelter beneath the wooden overhang by the horse shed. She didn't cry, didn't complain, just tied the tarp in place using the string from her own shirt, ripped in half. Silas lay on a folded mattress, his back propped against a thick piece of firewood. The bullet had grazed his shoulder. Not deep, but it had bled a lot. He didn't groan, didn't look at Delia more than necessary. Only when she returned with a bundle of herbs, leaves she'd learned to use during years spent hiding and running, did he narrow his eyes, then nod. It was the longest they'd looked at each other that night. No words. But something passed between them, through eyes caked with dirt, rain, and exhaustion. Something language couldn't hold. They sat beside each other by a small fire. No roof, no door. Only the sound of rain tapping on the oilcloth and the soft crackle of burning wood, like the heartbeat of someone who'd just returned from the edge of death. Delia poured hot water into a kettle. A light black tea, brewed from dry leaves Silas used each year before winter set in. He didn't say thank you. She didn't wait for it. Before them were 2 wooden cups, old, worn. One had a small cross carved into the bottom, a shallow mark as if someone had etched it quietly in the dark, not wanting to be seen. Delia turned the cup slowly in her hand. She didn't ask, but her eyes did, trying to read why he had kept it this long. Silas watched the fire, said nothing. But a moment later, he poured more tea into her cup, a small, slow gesture, but unmistakable. You can stay tonight. Outside, the stray cat, the one Silas had never named, was licking rainwater from a tin bucket. It turned to look at them, then walked slowly closer, curled up beside the fire. No one shooed it away. No one called it over. It was late. The wind had stopped howling. Silas closed his eyes, his shoulders trembling slightly as fever began to take hold. Delia fetched the last dry blanket, laid it over him, then sat beside him. She didn't sleep. She didn't leave. Tonight, she kept watch. Not out of fear someone might touch her, but because for the first time, she didn't want someone to leave without saying goodbye. There was no roof overhead, but there was fire. There was breath, and there were 2 people who had once believed they were too far gone to be held on to. Morning crept in like an old man rising slow. The light wasn't gold, it was gray. Clouds still clung heavy over the mountain peaks. No rooster crowed, no bird sang, only the soft crackle of wood and the rustling of Delia washing dried blood by the water's edge. Silas sat a short distance away, his back resting against a half-burned log, hands holding something faded, its torn paper edges gnawed by years of wind. An old map, folded in thirds, pressed between stiff cowhide. Not a military chart, not something you'd find at a gas station. It was hand-drawn, ink smudged, letters slanted and small, lines shaky as if drawn on a cold night by hands that had forgotten how to be steady. Delia turned when she heard the soft rustle of paper. Silas didn't hide it. He laid the map on the wooden crate between them. Slowly, carefully, like someone reopening a grave they'd once buried deep. Red Rock Ridge to the north, he said softly, not looking up. There's an old trail through the canyon. Follow that, stay inside the wash, then track the dry stream. Takes 3 days. Delia looked at him, but didn't reach for the map. She waited. Silas met her eyes, and for the first time there was a light in them that didn't come from fire. Something like fear and release. She and I were supposed to take that route, he said, his voice like gravel shaped by wind. We planned to head to Spring Valley, find good soil, plant apples, but... He paused, his hand tightening slightly. She didn't get well in time, and I didn't leave in time. The sentence fell like a horse stumbling mid-stride. No one spoke after that. Delia lowered her eyes to the map. Her hands trembled faintly. Silas placed another piece of paper atop it, a scrap he'd written on that morning with charcoal. On it, a few names, a stream with no name, and a red X marked with a note. Where the lightning-struck pine stands, turn left. You don't have to go, he said, his voice steady like flowing water. But if you need to, this is the way. Delia didn't cry. She didn't thank him. She only nodded, slowly, as if the nod had to pass through every person who'd ever denied her the right to choose. No one spoke of what day it was. No one mentioned Hunt's death. No one asked whether someone else might come. There were only two people, one who had survived a night of blood, and one who had given away something no one had ever offered, a way out that didn't ask for anything but courage. That noon, Delia tucked the map into a small cloth pouch, folded it carefully. Not like a thing kept just in case, but like a promise she wasn't yet sure she had permission to believe in. The next morning there was no wind and no rain, only the pale hush of dawn, like a thin layer of ash rising from the last red embers. The San Miguel River slowed its current, as if it too was listening for something. Silas woke first. He didn't wake Delia, just adjusted the log where he sat, poured coffee into 2 enamel mugs. Both chipped at the handle. One still bore the black smudge from when it was used to scoop engine oil 2 winters ago. He didn't wipe it clean, just tilted the pot, poured slowly, careful not to stir the grounds. Delia stepped out of the makeshift tent as the light turned just bright enough to reveal the mist. Her eyes were still shadowed, arms crossed, an old habit that hadn't yet let go after so many days on the run. But she didn't turn away, she didn't lower her face. Silas handed her the coffee, didn't ask, didn't insist. Delia took it, her fingers brushed his, hers cold, his dry as charred wood. Neither pulled away. They sat there, side by side, on earth still stained with dried blood from the night before. The wind carried the smell of burnt wood past them, pulling behind it a thread of memory no one bothered to name. Silas pointed toward the river. Maybe it doesn't go anywhere, he said quietly, his eyes on the water. Maybe it just bends and keeps flowing. Delia didn't reply, but her eyes followed his hand, watching the river as if seeing for the first time something that didn't chase or devour her. Beside the tent, Silas had strung up a drying line. On it hung a pair of old leather gloves, washed clean of blood, dried the day before. His son's gloves, left behind long ago when the boy left without a word. Silas unhooked them and brought them to Delia. She didn't refuse. She slid them on. The leather flexed gently over swollen knuckles, wrapping each bruised joint. Delia looked at her hands, then curled them into fists once, not to strike, not to hold, just to know she could grasp something without it being taken away. They didn't talk about the past, didn't ask about the scars, didn't ask whether the one who caused them was still alive. They didn't need to, because the fact that they were both here, on this very morning, was the only answer needed for now. A small squirrel darted by, leaving new tracks in the dew-soaked earth. Delia watched it go, eyes narrowing, as if it were the first living thing she'd ever seen that wasn't afraid. Silas poured more coffee. Didn't ask if she wanted any. He just poured, and this time, she held out her cup. That afternoon, the sky stretched out like an old oilcloth, the last rays of sunlight slipping through fallen leaves by the riverbank. Delia stood at the water's edge, the leather gloves still warm from Silas's hands. She hadn't spoken since morning, and she didn't need to. Silas knew. The time had come. He handed her a pouch of hard biscuits, a small knife, and the old map, its torn corners stitched with thread. The handwriting had faded with the years, but it was still clear enough to lead through the Red Rock Range, the path he once drew for his late wife, but never had the chance to take. Delia accepted it. Her hand trembled slightly, but not from fear, only because for the first time in her life, someone gave her something, without asking for her body, a promise, or her tears in return. They didn't hug, didn't hold hands, Didn't say, take care. Those things are easier when people know they'll see each other again. But here, between the red western soil and two hearts long splintered, you only leave behind what doesn't need to be packed. Kindness. Delia turned and walked away. Her figure slowly vanished behind the trees. She didn't look back. Silas stood still, his eyes dry, but his throat thick like gravel breaking inside a tin cup. When her last footsteps faded into the woods, he exhaled, not from loss, but from the release of something heavy he'd carried too long. That evening, he returned to the charred remains of the cabin. By the fireplace lay the silver spoon that had been flung aside during the blaze. He picked it up, wiped it on his sleeve. Not much cleaner, but he wiped it anyway. In the kitchen, he made soup. 2 portions, same as always, but for the first time in 12 years, he served both. No chair was empty, nothing left over. Just this, for the first time he didn't wait for the wind to cool it. He ate both bowls. Slowly, without hurry, without regret. Outside, the wind swept across the fields like a voice whispering, "One night to go on living. Sometimes that's all we need." Some people don't save the world, but they save the right person at the right moment. At that bend in the river, no one asked anymore why the old man always made 2 bowls of soup, and no one questioned why a woman who had left still left warmth behind on an old wooden chair. Not everyone gets to stay, but sometimes just one night is enough to go on living. If you've ever met someone like that, or if you've ever quietly saved someone without needing them to know, tell me about it. Even if it's just a small act, a glance, or a bowl of soup that cooled in the wind. Because out in the West, what lasts isn't the sound of gunfire, but what we leave in each other after we're gone.